Ukraine stands as a profound flashpoint of tension between Russia and the West. Since the Euromaidan revolution of 2014, the conflict with Russian-backed separatists in the country's east has claimed over 13,000 lives. The Crimean Peninsula has been occupied and unilaterally annexed, and with Russian troops now massing at the Ukrainian border, we are compelled to ask, how did we arrive at this critical juncture, and what is Ukraine's deep significance to Russia? Welcome to Strategic Horizon, where we delve into the complex geopolitical landscape shaping our world. Ukraine holds immense historical and cultural importance for Russia. Their shared history stretches back nearly 1,000 years to the Kingdom of Kievan Rus, whose capital, Kyiv, is still affectionately known as the Mother of Russian Cities. For many Russians, including President Vladimir Putin, Ukraine is an integral part of what he terms historic Russia, and he views Ukrainians and Russians as one and the same people. Indeed, approximately 30% of Ukrainians, predominantly in the eastern regions, speak Russian as their first language, and 15% of the population identifies as ethnically Russian. Over the past 300 years, examining the borders of both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union reveals that Ukraine and Russia were often part of the same country. Throughout this period, Ukraine, alongside Belarus, served as a crucial strategic buffer against invasions, notably during the Napoleonic Wars and both World Wars. The port of Sevastopol in Crimea has historically been Russia's primary warm-water naval port, and after centuries of shared existence, Ukraine developed into a significant industrial base for weaponry within the larger state. However, this long-standing unity shattered when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Bankrupted by its costly military operation in Afghanistan, reeling from the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, and crippled by an inefficient economy, the USSR disintegrated after failed reform attempts in the 1990s. Nationalist movements across the Union declared independence, marking what many Russians perceived as the fall of historic Russia. On that fateful night, the red flag descended over the Kremlin as President Gorbachev resigned, ending 7 decades of communist rule. 15 independent states emerged, inheriting a disastrous economy and an uncertain future. The Soviet Union not only lost its Warsaw Pact satellite states, but, with the independence of its 15 republics, Russia also lost Ukraine. In a mere 2 years, the geopolitical map of Eastern Europe was dramatically redrawn. In the aftermath, Russia and the other former Soviet republics signed agreements to normalize relations and facilitate trade. For Ukraine, this involved a critical exchange. It handed over 4,000 nuclear weapons in return for guarantees of its borders and sovereignty. The dissolution of the Soviet Union also ushered in a new era of relations between Russia and the West. Yet, these relations soon soured, primarily due to what Russia perceived as Western encroachment on its sphere of influence. A glance at the post-Cold War map reveals NATO's significant eastward expansion, dramatically reducing Russia's strategic buffer from over 2,000 kilometers to less than 1,000 kilometers. For Russia, this expansion represented a breach of what it claims was a promise by the West to maintain NATO's existing borders, a promise the US and NATO unequivocally deny ever existed. While this understanding was never formalized, and Russia may now exaggerate its original formulation, it's clear that, at some level, there was an expectation that NATO would not expand eastward. This is precisely where Ukraine enters the critical discussion. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine initially sought to maintain a delicate balance between Russia and the West, deliberately avoiding full integration with either side. While many former Soviet states joined Russian-led regional organizations, Ukraine largely kept its distance. However, the country was plagued by deep corruption and controlled by powerful oligarchs. In 2004, after an election widely condemned by Western observers as rigged, a massive protest movement, dubbed the Orange Revolution, erupted onto the streets. Partially fueled by Western support for the protesters, the election was rerun, and the reformist opposition, led by Viktor Yushchenko, emerged victorious. This marked the beginning of Ukraine's rapprochement with the West. The country was invited to join NATO in 2008 and became part of the EU's Eastern Partnership in 2009. Yet, by 2010, the reformists were weakened by internal political infighting between the president and prime minister, ultimately losing the election to Viktor Yanukovych. At this juncture, Ukraine faced a stark choice: closer ties with either the European Union or Russia, leading both blocs to vigorously compete for influence within the country. Ukraine, which had been on the verge of signing an association agreement with the EU, abruptly halted the process to pursue a deal with Russia instead. This decision ignited the Euromaidan protests. Pro-EU demonstrators demanded that the agreement with the European Union be reinstated. Following a violent government crackdown, the protests escalated into a full-blown revolution. The demonstrators, initially backed by EU leaders, ultimately succeeded in overthrowing Yanukovych's government. Few could have predicted the rapid succession of events, with Parliament swiftly voting President Viktor Yanukovych out of office. This dramatic shift deeply divided the country and triggered a severe backlash, particularly in the Russian-speaking East. Both the Orange and Euromaidan revolutions profoundly angered Russia, which interpreted them as manifestations of an expanding U.S. sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. In direct response to the Euromaidan events, Russian troops invaded Crimea, swiftly securing the strategically vital port of Sevastopol. Russia claimed it needed to defend the Crimean Peninsula from a potential NATO attack, though this was not its sole motivation for deploying such significant forces. Roughly a year and a half after the annexation, the Kremlin also initiated operations in Syria. To legitimize its actions, Russia hastily organized a referendum in Crimea, where 96% of voters reportedly chose to join Russia. However, given that a substantial portion of Crimeans already identified as Russian, the outcome might have been similar even under a legally recognized vote. Simultaneously, Russia began backing separatists in eastern Ukraine, aiming to destabilize the country and thwart its growing alignment with the West. Ukraine's then disorganized army found itself relying on various militia groups, some with far-right leanings, to defend its borders. This ignited a brutal 7-year conflict, with civilians paying a heavy price through indiscriminate bombing. While Russia and Ukraine reached a peace agreement in 2015, known as Minsk II, which aimed for a political settlement and the reunification of Ukraine with its separatist provinces, the agreement has largely stalled. Eastern Ukraine has consequently devolved into a frozen conflict. In response to these actions, the European Union and the United States imposed sanctions that have isolated and weakened the Russian economy. These sanctions, coupled with the unresolved status of Ukraine, continue to poison relations between Russia and the West. However, in March 2021, Russia began deploying an unprecedented number of troops near the Ukrainian border. While Russia had conducted military exercises in the region before, this time, something felt profoundly different. Why, after 7 years, had the situation become so volatile? The answer lies with Ukraine itself. Since 2014, its democracy has notably consolidated, improving its standing in international rankings. The country has also grown increasingly assertive toward Russia. A series of controversial language laws, implemented since 2016, have progressively removed the Russian language from media, business, and education. Meanwhile, Crimea, cut off from the mainland, faces severe water shortages. Ukraine's army has undergone significant modernization, acquiring advanced American anti-tank missiles and Turkish drones. As Russia actively seeks to integrate residents of the separatist regions by issuing them Russian passports, Ukraine increasingly views the Minsk II agreement as a potential Russian Trojan horse. This evolving political landscape and Ukraine's improved military capabilities have ignited Russian fears that Ukraine might attempt to retake the separatist regions by force. By November 2021, Russia began moving even more troops to the border, prompting widespread international concerns of an imminent invasion. While both European and American leaders discussed imposing severe costs on Russia for intervening in Ukraine, they steadfastly refused to intervene militarily. Yet Russia's demands extended far beyond Ukraine, calling for sweeping security guarantees that would effectively push NATO's borders back and re-establish its historical buffer, essentially rolling back the clock to 1999. Western leaders interpret this as Russia's overt attempt to re-establish its sphere of influence across Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, mirroring its interventions in Kazakhstan and Belarus. With Russian troops massed at the border and negotiations having failed, the future for Ukraine, a nation increasingly looking to the West, remains profoundly uncertain. We will continue to monitor these critical developments closely.